there's so much to begin with. And let me say, first off, as you know, I released Conversation in the Rejects, which is the expanded reissue of my second album. And that came out in December of last year. It's only a few months ago, but it was last year on the 29th. So with that right now, working on that, doing some video things, getting it out there for people and doing that. So the main thing right now is that record. There's a million other things going on at the same time. But one of the things that I've been in the process of doing for years is reissuing the old catalog, things that were reissued that are out of print, and also releasing for the first time a lot of recordings that go back into the early 1970s. So we've got early recordings that are, not so back in the day, both studio and live. We've got other releases that were out there that I'm in the process of reissuing. Also composing all the time. There's also a lot of back catalog of songs that I've written. So it's kind of doing all those things sort of at once.
How do you budget your time generally?
It's really, really hard. And I realize we're in a world now where everybody would say, that's right, say it, like everybody is going through that. So what it is that I have to do is really try and have a project mapped out as well as I can. And let's say pragmatism is not my strongest point, and where, say, being in the moment, letting whatever happens happen, flow through me, that's more my default. So trying to be inspirational and pragmatic at the same time. So say with Conversation in the Rejects, I worked on it for 20 years. And it's not to say that it was only that project that I was working on, but during that 20-year period, there was so many different things that had to happen, and at a certain point, having it mapped out was better than just kind of flying by the seat of your pants, to use an old cliche. So it's a question of trying to be inspirational, which comes really naturally to me, being spontaneous, which comes really naturally to me, and being sort of in this linear thing of, well, we're in physical form, and you've got to map it out, and you've got to go from point 1 to 2 to 3, and that is not that natural to me. It's an acquired skill for me, and I've acquired it out of necessity more than enjoyment, if you know what I'm saying. In other words, being organized, making sure that everything makes sense, it's all written out on paper in your notebooks, whatever, online. That's what I've been doing. So it's a question of trying to do that. And my tendency is to take on too much because of how excited I get about everything. So I keep it pulled back enough where it's borderline too much most of the time, but I've at least got a handle on it. Because like I said, with Conversation in the Rejects, it was a tremendously complicated project to release. I mean, starting with the idea of I had the tapes. So I had all the tapes, which most artists don't have the tapes to their work. And I happened to have all the tapes, the 24-track tapes and the 2-track masters. And in 2004, I took them into Chicago Recording Company and had them digitized to Pro Tools, which was also complicated because the tapes had to be baked. They reach a point, and most musicians obviously know this, where the tapes can no longer be played because the magnetic particles are, I guess you could say, they're straying from the tape, or they're not as attached to the tape. I'm not sure the exact...
It breaks down over time.
Yeah, right. Of the technical terminology, so they had to be baked in ovens. So I'm in the studio, tape is in the oven, it comes out, we get one play out of it. And so that went on for quite some time. It wasn't just a one-day kind of a thing. So once that happened, then I had to get the legal rights back. And getting the legal rights back was also complicated, and I was able to achieve it. Then from there, a lot of what happened was the creative project, the creative process, what's it going to be called? It went through a lot of different titles. You could go Conversation Expanded, and I thought, okay, it's so boring, it's terrible, right? And then I had Conversation and the music they wouldn't let you hear. And I thought, well, that's good, but it's too long. So finally I settled on...
It's a little clunky.
Yeah, a little clunky. That's a perfect word. I like that word. It's a little clunky. So if you're going to say it, people are going to then probably abbreviate it with letters like C-A-T, they're going to do it like that. So then we came up with Conversation in the Rejects, And I felt that was really good, especially because the main point of this record is that it wasn't just reissuing the conversation record. It was a whole nother record of the tracks that IRS records hated. They hated them so much and considered them to be just so controversial. And what makes it kind of an oxymoron, I guess you could say, is that they were known for being the super trailblazing label. And then here it was, I pushed it too far, they hated it, they wouldn't release it, and no one knew about those recordings in terms of hearing them. I mean, I talked about them a bit in blog posts or online, but no one had ever heard them because I had the tapes. They weren't bootlegged by somebody in the record company or even somebody who worked for the record company because they didn't have the tapes. So once Conversation and the Rejects came out, it was a real milestone. And obviously it was born of a tremendous amount of emotional pain and PTSD and just so much baggage. But that when it came out, there was a real sense of, I'm really happy this is out there for the fans. And I really tried to make it as special as I can for the fans. It was really important to me with everything that I do is to try and make it the best it can be for the fans. And so far, everybody who's gotten it has really loved it. I don't take that for granted because you never know. You always can get a dissenting opinion potentially, but everybody who's gotten it so far has really, really liked it. So that's kind of the main thing that's going on right now. I'm kind of deciding in the back of my mind, what's the next reissue going to be? And I'm not sure which one it's going to be, but there's a lot of back material. Like, I could be doing this for years. And so I want to expedite the process as much as possible, but at the same time working on new things as well too. So it's a lot to do, especially when you're on your own, and I don't mean that literally, but it's not like as if that I have the, I guess you could say the benefit, maybe it's not a benefit, of a major record company, because a major record company would have never spent anywhere near the money it took to release Conversation and the Rejects correctly. They would have Xeroxed the old cover, made it look like crap, wouldn't have even made it look better on CD visually as opposed to a vinyl. You know how they do that. They just slop it together. So I took all of this care in doing it, and I do have a great team of really talented people. But I mean, basically, I'm in charge of this whole thing, but I'm really grateful I have Smash Plastic in Chicago. They do a phenomenal job with vinyl. Just incredible. Katie Hildreth, a visual artist, my wife, is fantastic with helping with things. And just there's a lot of people, you know, in that small team who bring a great deal of value to the table. And I'm really aware, as most of us are at a certain point, that no one can do it on their own. So it's not as if that anybody could get arrogant or cocky and say, well, I did this, and make the I sort of exaggerated. It really is a team effort, and that's not being said to sound mock humble either. It's the truth. So everybody brought a lot to the table with it, but it was hard figuring what's going to be the right way to release this, because in one hand, you have two very different records. The Rejects are among the most controversial my band ever did. Then Conversation was a toned-down record that the record company made me do to tone it down. It was preposterous beyond belief to think that they're going to somehow make me normal, that was the objective. Like, we're going to make you normal. And obviously it didn't work, because my first album sold twice as much as the first album, right? I mean, the first album sold twice as much as the second album. And the pushback on Conversation when it was released in 1983 was brutal. Everybody hated it. My fans hated it. The press hated it. Everybody said I sold out, which was really one of the hardest things for me to have to deal with because it wasn't true.
IRS, I mean, granted a little bit before my time, but looking at the roster of acts they had over the years, you call them trailblazing, and certainly they had easily some of the best artists at the time. What's your sense of what they thought they were getting with you that ultimately they didn't get?
Well, I know what happened. I mean, I'm real clear on what happened. Okay, according to Miles Copeland, I was the first American artist and second worldwide to be signed to IRS Records. In the very beginning, they were wide open. It was like, you do your record. They left me alone. I wasn't bothered at all by them whatsoever. They didn't do anything. Okay? So then that record turned out basically the way that I wanted it to be. Okay? Then what happened from there is that they went commercial and safe and corporate. So what happened between my first album recorded in 1979 and my second album turned in November of 1982 is they changed. The record company went toned down and safe. So I have to deal with this idea that Miles Copeland used to say he's a fucking genius all around the world. Everybody I'd run into, oh, you're the guy who says he's a fucking genius, ha ha ha. And I'd say, oh, geez, I have to hear this all the time, right? And then go into, what's this fucking shit you're singing about? Freaks and Barbie dolls and freaks. I won't release it. Okay? So anybody who's heard the Rejects knows that the quality is absolutely up to standard for what I was known for doing. It wasn't as if that I had a refrigerator being recorded with crickets in it for 30 minutes. Okay? It wasn't as if I recorded outside noise and called it art. And I'm not even disparaging that. I'm saying that it wasn't that kind of an obvious thing that a record company would have a problem with. So the second album that I turned in simply built on the first. It was completely logical. In other words, take what you did with the first album and do it with the second. So IRS Records changed, and they became safer, more corporate, and it's kind of this weird contradiction, like, okay, be different, but not too much. Have orange hair, but don't sing about anything too weird. And so what had happened is that I did what I would have expected to do. I took the narrative further. They hated it because they, and it was very much proven as it comes to what Miles Copeland said to me, because we were in my tiny little apartment behind my parents' house, which I was living in at the time. It was a converted garage, 3 itty-bitty rooms. And Miles Copeland came to stay with me when we were doing the new recordings for the second album, the ones that had to be toned down. And he sits there with the whole band. We were all there in this my little itty-bitty living room. And he takes out this cassette he brings all the way from California. And he plays New Order, Blue Monday, and Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. And he goes, you need to change. This is how I want you to sound. So there is no pretense that he was trying to work with me as an artist. He was trying to change me and make me acceptable, for lack of a better word.
At least to my mind, those are two very good songs. Obviously different than what you were doing. What's that process of...
Well, completely different.
What's the process of trying to, I guess, in a sense, meet halfway?
Well, it was hell on earth, really. But the point of it is that specifically, I did not attempt to sound like Blue Monday or Michael Jackson. I was not willing to go to that level. I just wasn't. I just couldn't even attempt to do that. But the process of it was really, really tough because I'm dropped this bomb is dropped on me. You've got to change. And also it was designed to make me feel so terrible about myself. You know, it wasn't just like, hey, Jim, we can't work with this. It was like this whole mean, aggressive, like, what in the fuck is wrong with you? So it was really hard emotionally. And so what it is that Glenda Harrison and I regrouped and said, okay, this is what we have to deal with. We're going to try and write this record. I wrote some of it and we co-wrote some of it. And it was really, really tough because, and you can look at any example of this where a person cannot be who they are, whatever it is. Say, for example, if your parents are saying, you've got to be a born-again Christian or we're kicking you out of the house. Okay? Or if it's an issue of sexuality or whatever it is. So it was like, you have to be somebody you're not. And the thing that was so hard about it is I thought, did he forget who he signed? Did he forget that this is me? In other words, that I had been bullied and attacked my entire life, pretty much every day. Okay, not just by students, but by teachers. Choked by a teacher, locked in a broom closet, and everybody left the school by a teacher. This is what happened to me. So when I was doing the Skafish band, I was on fire about this. It was a lot of social commentary filtered through my personal experience that proved to be quite prophetic in the sense that what I was singing about then makes more sense today. In other words, because back then people would be like, well, you're really weird. And some people loved it. It wasn't as if everybody hated it, but there was a lot of violence toward me as a performer. Our lives were threatened on a fairly regular basis. And so it was the idea that when you have this identity, and it was the redemption factor, this is what I believe and this is what I do, and then it's just taken away from you. It was very, very hard. And I would say the experience was extremely tough, because then when Miles Copeland came into the studio, he was throwing the tapes against the wall. He was screaming at us. We could barely keep our composure to cut the record. Interestingly, the record turned out good. It was just not interesting from a subject matter point of view and not as avant-garde. But there were hits on that record, we believe, they didn't bother to push them. So it wasn't as if the music ended up being bad. It just wasn't the record that I wanted to put out. Really, that the aftermath of it was worse than the experience. Because then the record's not ever released again on vinyl. It's not put out on CD. It's not put out digitally. It sits there for decades. Then I have to go through this legal process of trying to get it back and all those things that happened. So it was a really difficult process, and then being dropped by the label. And I think, I don't want to say the worst part, but one of the worst parts is that people thought I sold out, and I was furious about that. In other words, and it was way before social media, right? So I couldn't go on Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or any platform and tell my story. And so it was kind of just sat there for all these decades. And then I was really happy when I put out Conversation in the Rejects. I was able to, through the liner notes and through what I've let people know, exactly what happened. So in other words, this is exactly what happened. It wasn't my decision to do it. And yet, you could use this example. It's like being in a bad marriage for the kids. Like, oh, I've got to stay in this bad marriage. I'm hoping to get it through it for the kids. You know, that a lot of people can relate to that. Most people can't relate to being cast out by your record company because it's kind of a unusual experience. So when I agreed to do it, I thought, well, we don't have any options. We're flat broke. We can't. I barely had money to eat on. We didn't have any other options. It was really rough. So I thought, well, I've got to try and do something. Let's see if something good could come out of it.
It strikes me, you know, with the benefit of A, being outside and B, quite a bit of hindsight, that it's an example of you spending so much of your life fighting both to determine what your identity is and to find the right people to surround yourself with, to create that art, and really having, you know, several years of momentum only to be, in a sense, greeted with the same thing that you had been met with when you were younger.
It's a good way of putting it, Brian. I think it's very true. And the thing that was so hard about it is that, you know, the press loved us or hated us. People were oftentimes trying to attack us at our shows, sometimes in a way that became life-threatening. I could live with all that, actually. I could live with even the idea of everybody finding colorful ways to make fun of me and talk about how freaky I am and all of that. But then, when the rug is pulled out from under you by a person that you thought was on your side, who was pivotal to what you were doing, it was devastating. And especially when you believe in this relationship. And I think if we use it in a more personal analogy, we've all had somebody we thought was a best friend who turns out to be a fair weather friend and throws us under the bus. Or somebody we're dating who we think really loves us and they're just using us and they're going to discard us and cheat on us. It was like that. And going through it, the PTSD actually became worse as the years went on because there wasn't any resolution. So it was this whole long process. I mean, the record came out, my reissue of the record came out 40 years later. So this wasn't even, say, 10 years or 5 years. And I know for young musicians who are maybe 18, when they think of 40 years, it seems like cryptic and unable to be processed, right? But it was that, and I felt so much baggage around the whole process that it took me getting the music together and out there and remastered by Trevor Sadler. Great remastering job. He's remastered records for Madonna, Nine Inch Nails, Ramsey Lewis, Steely Dan, David Byrne. I'm so fortunate to have him working for me. Since 2005, by the way. He's done all of my records. And so once I heard everything, I came to realize I really liked the music. Because I was made to feel so horrible about all of it. From one end, with Miles Copeland, like, who in the fuck do you think you are? What in the hell's wrong with you? Like, as if you're the person at the dinner table who's eating with your fingers and slobbering food all over the place. It's like that kind of an example. To the other end of it, with my fans who wanted that kind of a record, who hated the second album. Hated it. And so it was that sense of trauma was deep inside. So when I got the record out there and I finally said, God, I really love this music. And I love the way I put it together, put both records into one. I'm not going to try and be slick and do the weird record and the normal record. Just put it all together. Let people decide. I was really happy with it. But still, the trauma of the experience is still a factor.
How profound of an impact did I guess in a sense, the failure of that record have on your career? Did it completely sideline you?
Well, not completely, but it really changed everything in a way that could be arguably said for the worse. I'm not trying to pronounce it in a doom and gloom way. No, I didn't get sidelined because I didn't let it happen. So what had happened is I continued doing what I've done ever since then. From then until today, it was just at a smaller level. So I wasn't able to tour internationally like I did under Miles Copeland and IRS. So what had ended up happening is that it made it so much harder. So in other words, I released limited series cassette as my first independent release in 1988. That's going to be reissued. It's been out of print for a long time. It was a great idea because I had Aretha Franklin's backing singers on 2 tracks. I had Jeff Ward, drummer for Ministry and Lard, and Nine Inch Nails. He played for them for a while. He was on drums on a couple tracks. I had a great horn section they had played for Brian Wilson. But what had happened is I had to start doing everything on my own. So I was making recordings on my own from front to back. And so when I did limited series cassette, it was a mixture of me doing everything, and I had some guests. I did Best Kept Secrets in 1992, and that was pretty much all on my own. Those were both cassette releases only. Then I did, my holiday jazz album in 2005. We recorded it. And that was a real departure because it was unlike anything anybody would think that I would do. And strangely, out of all of my independent releases, it's the most successful. And it is a traditional, straight-up jazz record. And because I was skilled in classical and jazz piano, I did that. Then I released What's This?, which is a compilation of 1976 to 1979. Another single solo track, Nothing I Can Do, and then the reissue of the first album and the second album have come out. But there's a great deal of back material, both studio and live, but it made it a lot harder. In other words, it was hard to do the bookings. It was hard to get any type of shows going. It was very, very hard. So it was the kind of thing that it was rough. So everything was a lot smaller. But you do the best you can with what you have. But I was unwilling to give up. In other words, that was a real key point. I was unwilling to say, I'm out. I wasn't going to do that. And so as difficult as it was, and there were other things that happened with it too, okay? I was teaching music. I also taught at a college level briefly. I was playing with my keyboardist band Javier Cruz. We had like kind of a new wavy dance kind of a thing happening. I was playing on some other people's records, doing some production, not necessarily of hit records. So there was a lot going on. But it definitely, I mean, the choice Miles Copeland made changed my life forever. There's no question about it. It changed everything. And I'm not saying that I have even a smidgen of resentment toward him, because I don't. I love Miles Copeland. A lot of the things he did for me were great blessings. But what he did with the second album really made everything difficult for me. There's no way to pretend that it wasn't, and I'm not willing to spin it to try to make it sound like, oh, baby, it's rock and roll, deal with it. It was horrible. But at the same point, I don't hold any malice toward him at all.
An incredibly painful experience. It sounds like in a lot of ways he didn't handle it particularly well. But have you been in touch with him after that? Have you discussed what happened?
It's an interesting question. He and I have never discussed what happened, but I have been in touch with him quite a few times for different reasons. Okay, so I haven't talked to him in a while, but over the years I've talked to him. Like, say, for example, when Urga Music War was released by Warner Brothers, okay, and they did kind of a shoddy job. They didn't have the master tapes, and they took a copy and they put it out there with some club-looking kid on the cover, right? And they made it as a made-to-order DVD. He didn't know about it. He didn't even know. So I called him and we talked about it. Around that time, I volunteered if there was anything I can do to help get Urga Music War back out there again. And that didn't go anywhere. I even suggested, well, why don't we talk to Sting? Because I was always on good terms with Sting. We were always real cool with each other. In fact, when my bass player's bass broke in France, he let my bass player use his bass. There was that sense of camaraderie. I mean, when I was touring with those groups, XTC, The Police, U2, UB40, English Beat, Squeeze, all those groups, it was a great experience because we could have easily been treated like crap. We were the low men on the totem pole, right? We could have easily been treated bad, but we were treated great. They didn't have to treat us well. No one's going to yell at them if they don't. So it was the kind of thing that went nowhere with trying to get Sting involved. They're like, no, he won't want to. They didn't even really run it by him. But I volunteered that. Also, I was talking to Miles Copeland about other things. So yeah, I've been in touch with him, but we hadn't talked about this experience, which I'd be willing to talk about, but it just hasn't unfolded in that way.
Obviously, very difficult to process, and there is a sense in which it was a failure, but I wonder if there's also a sense in which that experience was edifying from the standpoint, all the success that you had up till that point was you being yourself, and this first time when you tried to really, fit into someone else's version of you, that's where you got knocked off track. So isn't there a sense in which that is kind of a validation of what you had been doing all along?
Well, in a weird kind of a way, yeah. I mean, I'm not trying to wrap it up in a pretty package, obviously, because it was painful, and there's no denying that. But I never wanted to be like anybody else anyway. In other words, so it wasn't like I suddenly thought, wow, maybe I could be like some singer in a weird little haircut and just bopping around the stage and singing about things that don't matter or don't matter to me, okay? It was the idea that it was like trying to make yourself somebody you're not to make a relationship work, and it failed. I went back and had to regroup, worked quickly into regrouping, but that process, to your point, was very painful. Because then there was still the idea of all of this guilt and all of this emotional trauma that even if it wasn't mentally, say, rubber stamped, like I'm a terrible person, I'm worthless, I'm a terrible artist, I have nothing to offer, it was how I felt because of all of the brutality of what had happened. And it's sort of like, okay, like I said before, all this stuff was happening. And it was really rough going through those years on a multitude of levels. I mean, there were some good times, not many. And then you're always hoping to have that victory at the end. It's like being an athlete and you're on a team that's like, less than 500. And then you're hoping that you're going to be able to get that team into a winning slot. And it didn't happen. The whole thing fell apart. So the regrouping part of it was painful, but I did it. And I was making recordings. A lot of them are, at absolutely the same quality in terms of the aesthetic value and what it is. A lot of variety, a lot of diversity, but no, that is that I had to claim that back, but there was no way I was ever going to be like anybody else. And it just wasn't going to work, right? And especially because even when we talk about, people say, well, who influenced you? And I'd say hardly anybody. I was inspired, but not influenced.
What's the distinction?
Here's the distinction. Inspired, feeling excitement by what somebody's doing, helping that to invigorate who you can be, motivational, influenced where you're going to try and sound like them or use some of their techniques or some of their things. I never tried to be like anybody. And if there's anybody, any kind of music that you could say was influenced by, it would be classical music. That would be the one form of music that I would be influenced by. I loved Little Richard. I never wanted to sound like Little Richard. I never did anything Little Richard did. I didn't sing like him. I didn't do anything like, but I loved him. Loved him. I loved Weather Report. I loved the New York Dolls. But I wasn't trying to let what they do assimilate into my aesthetic. Do you get what I'm saying?
But what I would say is that, especially, the Weather Report, that's a different story, but Little Richard and the Dolls specifically, maybe toss, Bowie in there, are two examples of sort of working against gender norms, which was clearly a really big part of what you were presenting.
Well, right, but that was natural to me anyway. Okay, so in other words, it wasn't like I saw Bowie and thought I could do that, or saw the Dolls. I saw them as being comrades, and I'm not saying that I was equal to them in musical stature in my career at that point. I was a kid, right? But what I'm saying is that was already there for me. And with doing the gender thing, it was very different than what David did, which was glamorous, and even what the Dolls did. I was doing it in an extremely ugly, deliberately ugly, unattractive, non-flattering, queer way. And I was absolutely one of the first to do anything like that, for sure. Certainly the first in Chicago, maybe the first worldwide, but at least one of the first one or two to do that specifically.
To you, why is that an important distinction?
It's a huge distinction because it's like if you say rock music, and people could say, well, rock music could be Yngwie Malmsteen. Rock music could be Johnny Thunders. But there's a huge difference. If you're trying to look in any kind of a surgical way, there's a huge difference between me presenting myself, I'm ugly, I don't know if I'm a boy or a girl, you're going to really freak out at me, there's no glamour here, and I'm throwing it in your face. It's hugely different than what David or the Dolls did.
Clearly there's a sense in which this kind of came with the territory and came naturally, but were you... And I'm thinking a lot about this now famous story of you opening for Sha Na Na, and there being a lot of backlash in person. But
we almost died.
Was there a sense in which you were deliberately trying to provoke?
Well, I wouldn't say that I was deliberately trying to have somebody pull a gun on me, which is what happened at the Sha Na Na show. But it was this sort of in your face, full out, not considering, like, I want you to like me. Say, for example, a lot of entertainers are very based in approval. And I'm not criticizing that. Like, they want the audience to like them, they want to be approved of, etc. This was more, you could say it was a combination of primal therapy, life or death survival, throwing it out there, with maximum intensity. So it wasn't like, ha ha ha, I'm going to provoke you in a kind of a snarky way, but it was non-compromising. And then certain people loved it, certain people hated it, and there was a great deal of violence directed toward us through the career. It wasn't just, a few instances here and there.
Is there a sense in which you... Obviously not in the case of somebody pulling a gun on you, but is there a sense in which you almost fed or thrived on some of that pushback?
In the moments on stage, yeah, it's kind of like survival. It's like if somebody attacks you, you're in survival mode, right? Like say if a bunch of people are mugging you or something. I'd work with it. I was definitely not wanting to get off stage. So it was the idea of certainly not backing down. Not backing down. Certainly that energy could keep our adrenaline going. But it was hard because there was times where there was so much violence in particular shows that we couldn't keep the show going. I mean, like sometimes the shows were stopped. The Chicago police stopped the Sha Na Na show because 6,000 people were rioting and getting ready to get on stage to kill us. And the person with the gun was in the audience. A friend of mine who was filming the set saw him. He was standing right behind him. He had the gun pointing right at me when the police stopped the show.
In a case like that, when you are in very real danger, obviously thriving on the adrenaline in a moment, but looking back on it, does that give you pause? Does that make you want to maybe tone it down or pull it back a little bit so you're not put in that situation?
No. I couldn't. At that point, say, I felt that it was all that I had and all that I was. I realized as the years have gone on, I've evolved into a much more multidimensional person, hopefully. But back then, it was the only thing. It's just as important to me now, but there's other things as well, if that makes sense.
It does.
And so, but when you think fight or flight, okay, we were always in fight. So it's that simple. In other words, we didn't sit there and run off the stage. I mean, we did the first Milton Keynes show in London in 1980 in front of 45,000 people. And they were throwing full beer cans at us on stage to a point where the headstock off the guitar got knocked off. There was so much beer splattering, we were falling on stage, and then I got hit in the head with a beer can and was bleeding, and that's what stopped the show. That was one that stopped the show. Okay, so with that particular show and the Sha Na Na show, it couldn't continue. And other ones did continue for various reasons. But no, it was a fight or flight. I never thought for a minute like I should tone it down. I never did. And I never felt that I should try to suck up. Like, hey, I'm just weird, but I'm okay. Any of that kind of stuff. I never felt that. And so when that whole cycle kind of ended is again when IRS records threw us under the bus. Because then that way the options I had were more limited, although I kept doing things.
Going from, all those years of an incredibly oppressive environment in Catholic school, when did the positive cycle begin? When was it clear that there was this avenue or this venue where you could really fully be yourself?
Well, I'm not sure that came really. In other words, I was going to be myself regardless. It depends on what you gauge it as. I mean, obviously, I have, a wife who I can be myself with. I have a son who I could be myself with. But it's not as if that there was kind of a light bulb moment, because even the abuse and the bullying continued way past. So it wasn't like as if all of a sudden I'm not on a big stage in rock and roll and all the abuse stopped. It continued in my life for decades. So in other words, that has been, there's no aha moment with that. To say, oh, aha, here it stops. Like as if you're going to put the end of the story and then he rode off into the sunset in the suburbs. I mean, that story is not my story.
Surely at some point it was clear that it was working, though, that you were onto something.
Well, I always knew that I was onto something as an artist, not so much from an arrogant point of view, but from a passion-driven point of view. So say, for example, the passion was consuming. I had to do this. And so I always was tied into that, but I wasn't sitting back with the metaphorical cigar and saying, oh, my God, I'm onto something. There was too much pain, too much frustration, too much difficulty, and it wasn't as if there was ever smooth sailing. So let's say if there was smooth sailing and you have platinum records and you could sit there and pat yourself on the back and, all that ego rubbish happened, right? That never happened because I was never in that position. But I always believed in what I was doing from an extremely obsessive point of view, but it was more of I had to do it versus I chose to.
This is, not a great game to play all the time, but I get the sense that even if those things had come to you, that you wouldn't have been happy or you wouldn't have been satisfied with them.
That's right. I think I would have still continued with the mission. Like, in other words, it wouldn't be like, oh, you're in the club now and you could just be like everyone else. For that sort of tribal acceptance thing that human beings like, oh, we're all this way or we're all that way. I don't think it would have made me soften, but it didn't happen, so it's hard to speculate. But my identity has always been too strongly formed. So in other words, it wasn't like I'd look at an artist and say, I'm going to be like them. I never had that. I never said, I will be like whoever, Chuck Berry, Elvis Presley, the Beatles. I never did that. But I loved so much art that it inspired me and made me feel like, well, I can feel this, I can do it, I can find what's within me. And that was important. But the fact of how different the project was made it really hard commercially. Always made it hard commercially. And that was really difficult, but I was unwilling to try to play it like a marketing person. I just wasn't willing to do it. I didn't want to have to live with that. And it may sound faux noble, and it's not meant to. It's the idea that I was not willing to compromise my integrity for anybody or anything. I just wasn't.
Obviously, I don't think most of us really know what it means to be our true selves when we're in our 20s. Regardless, there's a lot of
sure.
growth up that has to happen. But with a lot of these artists, as we're talking specifically about the ones who are breaking gender norms, there's a sense in which for a lot of them it is very theatrical. Was it purely theatrical, or was there really a deep-seated sense of yourself in that?
I would say it was totally myself. It wasn't theatrical, because if I was going to do it theatrically, I'd present it more glamorously, or present it more in a non-street way. It was not glamorous at all. In fact, it was the antithesis of glamorous. So if I'm wearing an old lady's old-fashioned one-piece bathing suit with a matching babushka on stage, it's not glamorous, it's ugly. If I'm wearing ugly pea-stained underwear or diapers or tube tops, it's not beautiful. Do you get what I'm saying? So no, it wasn't about this kind of like, welcome to your weird fantasy and enjoy it for the moment before you go back to your normal life. For the audience, it wasn't like that.
To a certain extent, I think we have, obviously there's a lot of pushback, but as a society, maybe a better understanding or at least more vocabulary to describe non-binary or gender as a spectrum. With that, in hindsight, do you feel that now in your life that you have a better idea of where you sit in that?
Well, within myself, yeah. I mean, that is fine. What I'm saying is that I think it's a much more, not convoluted, but contradictory thing. I would allege that the abuse of gay, transgender, non-binary people is worse today. Every time I can barely say it. Give me a second.
This has been the case forever. As people get more freedom, the pushback intensifies, and we're seeing that in a very real way right now.
Well, whenever I see kids who get murdered, that's the part that's...
Of course.
So I would argue that in one way it's better, in one way it's not. But I mean, when kids go to school and get murdered for being, who they are, it's really hard for me.
There's a very real way in which being that person on stage is empowering. Just, I'm sure that if you had something like that, and maybe you did to an extent, maybe you did in Little Richard or Bowie or the Dolls, but just being an example of that in the world is empowering for people who are trying to figure out who they are.
Oh, sure. Well, and, the fan base that I have, a lot of them have been with me from the beginning. And there's been new fans who have come too, but I get a lot of that feedback. And it's very, very, what would be the right word? I hate to say gratifying, because I'm not trying to be uppity about it or anything like that. But sure. And let me say this. I mean, when your identity is so formulated at such a young age, and your experiences are so extreme, and there's all these things that converged. I was heavily trained classically. So what separated me right there is that I could have easily become a classical pianist or a jazz pianist, and I was even going to get a music degree, but I couldn't because I had to form my band. I was too obsessed with it, right? It's the idea that they have all these convergences. And even if I did this right now, it would still be challenging for people. And if you're looking over 40 years ago, it was really hard for people. But it did have an audience, and it did have an impact. And, it's great when those things happen. But when I see the pain of people still getting murdered, it's really tough. I mean, I'm more composed. But there was a recent person who got beat to death in school in Oklahoma, and they died the next day, and I couldn't deal with it.
But yeah, I mean, that's a case of, you can trace.
Oh, I see myself in it. Of course I do.
You can trace that to some very systemic things and legislation and things that are happening on the state level in that case.
Well, it gets to a point where, obviously the way the world is right now, it's sort of like pop culture. Like, okay, a lot of entertainers, they could be this or that, or they could look a certain way, and maybe they could, quote unquote, get away with it. Are they really going to arrest Lady Gaga at a show? Or even somebody more avant-garde, right? Probably not. But it's the idea that that's sort of the illusory way it's presented in entertainment. When laws are there where kids can be murdered, and where they could be denied health care, and it's ghastly. So in other words, this dichotomy between this sort of free society and people being waged war against, and I think it's a terrible thing. And it's not even like decide which side of the spectrum you're on politically. I'm not even speaking of it in that way. I'm saying that there should never be a point in this country where people are killed because of the way they look, or because of their sexuality, or because of their race, or because they're fat, or because they're a woman, or because they're too tall, or because they look weird, or because they're on the spectrum. It just shouldn't happen.
It's one of those things that you say, and it seems very obvious, and yet here we are after all these years. It seems like common sense, but
well, and those are the things that I was talking about 40 to 50 years ago, and I'm saying they're more relevant today. And that's one of the things I'm excited about with the Rejects. Like, those topics and those songs are relevant today, not just when they were written years ago. In fact, they're more relevant. Let's Play Doctor is more relevant today in terms of gender confusion and gender misidentification, more relevant today than it was when I wrote it in the 70s. So I'm really glad about that, but certainly that sense of being ahead of the curve is not a glamorous place to be. So people say, oh, wouldn't it be great if you were ahead of your time? And I'd say, no, it's not great. I mean, what's great about it? In other words, because that's where there's this sort of glamorization of being out there, like as if you're in your own wonderful little world. But it's hard because people are narrow. Well, it's very lonely, but it's also brutal. People are phenomenally narrow-minded, and it depends on in what way, but overall. So if you get people who are open-minded, that's a really valuable thing. But people who are open-minded are oftentimes not people in power, as we all know.
Do you feel at this point in your life that you have a better understanding of who you are as a person?
Oh, totally. Yeah, completely. Let me say this. In a human form, we're not going to be perfect. It's not possible in a human form from a spiritual perspective. If you're saying, do I have a good understanding of myself and how I work? Yeah, much better so. Much better so. But I don't strive for perfection. And I think when people do, it's a very slippery slope because we won't be perfect in a physical body.
Yeah. It's a bit of a hacky question, but I think it's an important one.
Sure.
Decades of knowledge and experience, if you were able to talk to yourself in those early days when life was at its hardest, what advice would you impart on yourself?
Well, I'm happy to answer the question, but spiritually speaking, I try to never indulge the future or the past. I haven't achieved that yet.
It's more of an abstract question.
Yeah, here's what I would do. What I would try to reinforce to myself is that no matter what, keep it going. No matter what, do it. Don't let yourself get so, on the edge or disheveled or upset because of other people. No matter who it is, whether it's Miles Copeland, whether it's bad reviews, whether it's an audience trying to kill you, whatever it is, that sense of staying with it. Now, obviously, I stayed with it, but if I would have known the idea of just stay with it, it's what you should do, it's who you are, and that the value is in the process, not in the reward. The value is in the process of doing something, not in discernible, say, earthly or worldly kind of rewards. That at that point, I would have said that to myself. But still, nonetheless, I did see it through and went through it. It might have been a little bit emotionally easier, possibly.
Easier if you know that things are going to work out pretty well in the end, or relatively well.
Well, one of the things about it is that there's certain aspects of, if we know certain aspects of the future, we would not be able to live out what we're here to live out from a spiritual perspective. Certain things. So say if I would have known back then when I formed my first incarnation of my band at 19, my bass player was 16. Okay, if I would have known then, I could have never gone through this. I could have never did it. I would have not been able to go through this. If I would have seen clearly, this is what you're going to go through, I couldn't have done it. So at that point, I didn't know what the consequences were going to be. And I don't want to use the word naive, it's a little too disparaging. I was certainly unaware of how much pushback I was going to get. I was unaware of how much people would try to hurt me physically, and unaware of how much I would be disparaged. Like a perfect example of this. Okay, so many of my band members were classically trained, right? Okay, original bass player, master's degree from Juilliard now, has played with Tony Bennett, played bass for the Lyric Opera. Drummer Larry Myslivic, music degree from DePaul, went on to play for Iggy Pop. Javier Cruz, music degree from Chicago State. This one journalist named David Witz in 1978 in the Chicago Reader said, "Oh, the band can only play one chord together." Now, what's ludicrous about that is he was homophobic and transphobic, and he hated me, and he was open about that. But then to take the attack to the musicianship, that's the part that was so preposterous, because anybody who's ever seen my band plays know that the band is highly, highly proficient musically. no one in their right mind is going to debate that. They can hate what I do, but the caliber of musicians I had were at the top level worldwide. Okay? But in other words, that's the kind of thing you get with that kind of pushback, where the pushback was so not grounded. Like you could say, but see, you can't just say, I don't like you. I think you're weird and ugly and I don't like you, and leave it at that. You have to make the person wrong. So like when you attack somebody, you have to make them wrong, so then you're justified in what you're doing to them. It's not just like, well, I'm biased and I'm prejudiced and I hate you, you know. So in other words, that's what he did. But then he went too far, and he looks ludicrous now in retrospect, because that he's talking about a bass player who plays for the lyric opera. That's the level he's saying. Now, if we were drunk, which we never were on stage, high, which we never were, not rehearsed, which we never were, but that's the example of those kind of attacks that were always waged at me, and because they were so intense, part of me just believed that they were true. I'm not saying all of me, but part of me just felt, you know, so horrible. And so what fueled me was the obsessive desire and the unwillingness to give up. It wasn't like it was happy. Do you get what I'm saying? And it wasn't even like fun, you know, where people talk about like fun. Well, a little bit of fun, not much. Not much. And so, and especially because we had such high standards, that it wasn't like we'd sit there and, you know, have cigars after the show and talk about how great we were. It was always that it wasn't good enough, or what should we do better? And yet we were performing at this level that is very seldom seen. I've never met a drummer ever who could play Sign of the Cross from Erga Music War like Larry Myslovic. I've never met a drummer yet who can do that part. It's one of the most complicated drum performances ever. I'm saying that's the level it was, and yet we always felt like it had to be better. And it's torturous. Do you get what I'm saying? Because it has to be better. It has to be better. And looking back on it, you know, well, hindsight has that 20/20 thing, you could say. But, you know, obviously we loved the music. The band was elated when they got the conversation and the Rejects album. I sent it to them and, you know, gave it to them and all that. They were elated. Because when you hear it, where it's no longer the debris of being screamed at and yelled at and everybody hating it, then you could enjoy it for what it was. And for the music that it was. And like I said, I champion all musicians. I hope that everybody achieves their dreams. Everybody. In other words, it's a really rough gig. So I'd be the last person to disparage anybody. And especially with how much of it has been directed at me and all of us. But it's the idea that with that, people will always have to make you wrong to attack you, because then that makes them right.
It strikes me that having such a, I guess, pragmatic perspective of that time means that you never really get caught up in that trap of being overly nostalgic and overly romanticizing those struggles.
Oh, God, no. No. I'm just like, I'm grateful I got through it. Hey, I got through it. Like I'm alive. You know, no. In fact, you know, when my son was little and he was growing up, I was never like telling him war stories, like sit down with your old man. Listen, I never did that. And then eventually he's a musician, you know, and that's what he did. But when he became interested, like, oh, what happened with Joey Ramone or Sid Vicious? And then I tell him, you know, it's like, yeah, I tell you. But I didn't want it to be like there was these war stories, because, you know, it's a violation of spiritual law to live in the past or the future. And I know we all do it, but it's not good. And so what I'm saying is that since there's still so much emotional pain, that I have to stay grounded in the present tense. So no, I'm not nostalgic about it at all or romanticizing it, but I'm saying is that the idea that trying to navigate the emotions is, you know, you have to stay in the present tense. It's this great concept of like, you know, classical music, right? You talked about classical. You practice every day. One of my great classical piano teachers said to me, and it really hit me, you miss practicing one day, you notice it. You miss 2 days, your teacher notices it. You miss 3 days, everybody notices it. So that discipline and that focus is very, very useful for me. And also the passion to create and to go where, I sound like Star Trek, I don't mean it, to go where no one else is going. I mean, I'm not trying to be silly, but I mean, it's a boldly, I forgot that word. But whenever I've thought of this, it's always been to go where no one else would go. That's always been a huge, huge part of the Skafish band. In other words, we never wanted to be in a wave. We created the wave. Do you get what I'm saying? We created the wave. When you create the wave, at least in the time frame, you don't get credit for it. In other words, when you pioneer something, you don't get credit for it. It's usually the people who come after and water it down and hijack it that get the credit. That's usually what happens. Maybe in the long run you might get credit for it, but I mean, how long did it take for Little Richard to get any credit? What an amazing talent. And I say that with like great reverence for him, with no desire to be like him at all. You know, in other words, I can separate that between, oh God, I really love him. And, you know, so much like Muddy Waters and Willie Dixon, I love them. They were huge supporters of mine. And I never tried to be like them. But I mean, they were so supportive of me, it was unbelievable. And you figure, well, how does that work? The socioeconomic doesn't match, right? They took me in. We were managed by the same person. They welcomed me, took me in. Muddy Waters compared me to Mick Jagger in print. Willie Dixon referred to me as the best musician he knew. I thought they were going to have a real problem with the way that I looked. I really did. I thought, oh God, they're going to hate me. And what am I going to do? Say, don't hate me, I love you. And they just like were so welcoming. And it goes to show that their pain and mine is not completely different. I mean, it's racially different, sure, but they got it. And so I'm saying is that, no, you know, it's okay what happened before. I mean, we're talking about these things. It's intense because there's so much that we're reliving and all that, but no, I'm okay with it. You know, it's not like I'm clinically depressed or anything, thank God, you know. And it's the idea, too, that when you function, you know, if you're famous at a young age, then you could become a prima donna. Not good. Not good. Not good. So in other words, yeah, I take the dog out, you know, with my wife, you know, cook or whatever. You know, in other words, that sense of just being a person and just doing what you have to do is very useful. And like I said, after everything I've been through, I don't believe I'd ever be able to be that person who's like in the ivory tower and speaking with the fake accent and all that shit, right? I don't think I could ever be that. I hope I'm not giving myself too much credit, but I don't think I could because of what I've been through. You know, and it would always be, well, if we're making a record, is it a good record? If it's not good, fix it. If it's great, fantastic. If it's not right, you know, in other words, you look at it pragmatically, as opposed to with all of this trappings, you know, when certain people leave, they walk into the room with their ego, and it's this huge armor, and it's just so off-putting, right? No, I don't want to have anything to do with that.